You know, the guns of the American Civil War finally fell silent in the spring of 1865. But, actually, the conflict was far from over. Welcome to this explainer on the Reconstruction Era. For 12 incredibly turbulent years, the United States was locked in this high-stakes tug-of-war over the very soul of the nation. It was a period totally dominated by the massive challenges of abolishing slavery, figuring out how to reintegrate the defeated Confederate states, and, well, just trying to define what freedom and equality would actually look like in a completely shattered country.
Okay, let's dive into this. Here is our roadmap. First, rebuilding a broken nation. Then we'll look at the clash over control. After that, radical reconstruction and civil rights, followed by black empowerment and agency. Then we have to talk about the white supremacist backlash, and finally, the end and legacy.
So starting with part 1, rebuilding a broken nation, the aftermath of 1865. To really grasp the physical and economic devastation facing the South right after the war, we first need to lay out a cognitive map of the rapid, honestly almost whiplash-inducing legal shifts that define this 12-year period. We start with the absolute tragedy of Lincoln's assassination and the ratification of the 13th Amendment in 1865. Then we move through the rapid succession of the 14th and 15th Amendments, right up to the political compromise of 1877. It is a super compressed timeline, but it's just packed with massive historical milestones.
And behind those dates is a truly staggering number, 3.5 million. To put that into perspective, that was roughly 10% of the entire U.S. population at the time. Just imagine waking up and, overnight, the legal status of millions of newly freed people was completely altered. The entire plantation economy of the South, which had relied entirely on enslaved labor, was suddenly just gone. So these millions of individuals now needed integration into a free labor economy. They were moving to cities to find jobs or trying to secure land to farm, and all of this was happening while they faced a totally collapsed Southern banking system and ruined infrastructure. It was literally a monumental task.
To manage this incredible transition, Congress established the Freedmen's Bureau in March of 1865. And it's important to note, this wasn't just some charity. It became an absolutely essential tool. Newly freed people actively used the Bureau to help negotiate fair labor contracts with their former enslavers, to legalize their marriages, which had been completely denied under slavery, and to build independent communities. Northern teachers also traveled south under its umbrella to help provide education. But the Bureau's very existence sparked this intense political debate over exactly what the role of the federal government should be.
Which brings us to part 2, clash over control, President versus Congress.
Following Abraham Lincoln's assassination, Washington was completely paralyzed by a massive divide over who actually had the authority to direct Reconstruction and whether it should be punishing or lenient. And this brilliantly illustrates that divide right here. On one side, you had presidential Reconstruction under Andrew Johnson. He favored a very lenient approach. He pardoned many former Confederate leaders, focused heavily on states' rights, and totally blocked voting rights for black men. On the flip side, you had congressional Reconstruction, led by the radical Republicans. They demanded a strict approach, really stringent voting requirements that disenfranchised some former Confederates, strong civil rights protections for freedmen, and even the implementation of military districts to actually enforce these rules.
So President Johnson's lenient approach allowed Southern states to very quickly enact what were known as the Black Codes. These were highly restrictive state laws designed basically to ensure that freedmen remained a heavily controlled second-class labor force. Under these codes, black Americans had no voting rights, they couldn't serve on juries against white people, and they faced heavy restrictions on their movement and employment. Well, when Northern opinion caught wind of this, the outrage was just palpable. It effectively pushed the Republicans in Congress away from any sort of compromise and straight toward much more radical legislation.
Let's move to part 3, Radical Reconstruction and Civil Rights, the Constitutional Revolution.
Driven by that public outrage, Congress effectively took control of the entire process, repeatedly overriding presidential vetoes. The absolute bedrock of this congressional takeover is what we now call the Reconstruction Amendments. The 13th Amendment in 1865 officially abolished slavery. Then, the 14th Amendment in 1868 was just a massive leap forward, establishing birthright citizenship and guaranteeing equal protection under the law for everyone. Finally, the 15th Amendment in 1870 declared that voting rights could not be denied on the basis of race. Together, these legal milestones established a permanent federal framework for racial equality that literally still forms the basis of our civil rights today.
To really understand the logic driving those radical Republicans, you have to listen to this quote from Senator Charles Sumner. He argued, "We put the musket in his hands because it was necessary.
For the same reason, we must give him the franchise. The radical Republicans realized that just passing laws in Washington wasn't going to be enough. They fundamentally believed that giving the freedmen the right to vote, the franchise, was the only substantial, practical protection they could offer them against those local southern state governments.
Okay, Part 4, Black Empowerment and Agency, a New Political Landscape.
Now, what's really interesting about this slide is seeing the sheer scale of the change during this time. It was incredible. Armed with the vote, the formerly enslaved population completely transformed the political landscape. Thanks to the 15th Amendment, by the early 1870s, you have hundreds of black men serving in state legislatures all across the South. For example, look at South Carolina right here, 190 state legislators and 6 U.S. congressmen. In states where black Americans made up a majority or even a near majority, they formed these crucial political coalitions. They drafted new state constitutions, and they actively governed the very states where they had so recently been enslaved. It's a real game changer.
And it's amazing to think about the resilience here, because this empowerment went way beyond the ballot box. It was fundamentally about community building. Freed people rapidly established their own independent churches, primarily Baptist and Methodist, with their ministers often stepping up as really powerful political leaders. Furthermore, they successfully pushed for the creation of the very first universal, state-supported public education systems in the South. And economically, they completely rejected the brutal gang labor of the plantation days, insisting instead on establishing family-based labor groups so they could maintain autonomy over their own daily lives.
Which leads us into Part 5, the white supremacist backlash, violence and suppression.
Tragically, all of this incredible progress stood in stark contrast to the grim, violently contested realities on the ground in the South. Economically speaking, true independence was severely hindered by the rise of sharecropping. Because the freedmen lacked capital and the white planters still owned the land and all the tools, a system developed where landowners rented out small lots to farmers in exchange for a share of the crop. Being forced to produce cash crops like cotton and having to rely on local merchants for supplies on credit meant many freedmen, and poor white farmers too actually, became locked into this terrible cycle of routine indebtedness and poverty that would end up lasting for generations.
Meanwhile, the political backlash was characterized by sheer violence. Groups identifying as redeemers sought to restore white supremacy and basically re-establish Democratic Party control by force. And this wasn't just prejudice, it was a full-blown paramilitary insurgency. We see massive mob riots breaking out in Memphis and New Orleans in 1866. Organized terror groups like the Ku Klux Klan, the White League, and the Red Shirts formed. They engaged in extrajudicial violence, assassinations, and targeted terror campaigns aimed squarely at disrupting Republican governments and intimidating black voters to keep them away from the polls.
The situation on the ground became so dire that President Ulysses S. Grant had to intervene. As he noted to Congress, a condition of affairs now exists in some of the states, rendering life and property insecure. The power to correct these evils is beyond the control of state authorities. Basically, local judges and police forces were either completely unable or just unwilling to stop the violence, which forced the federal government to step back in.
So the crucial point is that this era became a direct tug-of-war between local terror and federal law enforcement. Under President Grant, Congress passed the Enforcement Acts between 1870 and 1871. These acts made it a federal crime to interfere with voting, office holding, or jury rights. The Ku Klux Klan Act was so severe it actually allowed the president to declare martial law and suspend habeas corpus. The government even created the Department of Justice, and this might surprise you, but its origins trace directly back to deploying federal prosecutors specifically to crush the Klan, which for a time they did quite successfully.
Moving to our final section, Part 6, The End and Legacy, 1877 and beyond.
Over time, a mix of political scandals and economic panic and just a general exhaustion in the North regarding Southern affairs caused support for Reconstruction to fade. The formal end really came with the Compromise of 1877. Following a highly contested and totally disputed presidential election, a political deal was struck. Republican Rutherford B. Hayes was awarded the presidency, and in exchange, it was understood that federal troops would cease playing an active role in Southern regional politics. Without the United States Army there to enforce civil rights and protect voters, the era of Reconstruction effectively drew to a close.
Let's move to the legacy and see how this all built up. Honestly, it's incredibly complex. Historians have to balance profound, tragic failures against foundational successes. On the one hand, Reconstruction absolutely failed to prevent a century of Jim Crow laws, widespread voter disenfranchisement, relentless poverty, and unchecked racial violence. But on the other hand, the federal union was restored, and the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments permanently inscribed the legal framework for equality and birthright citizenship right into the Constitution, tools that would prove absolutely vital to the civil rights movement nearly a century later.
It was a breathtaking experiment in interracial democracy that was violently overthrown, yet it left behind a constitutional legacy that forever changed the United States. So what do you think? Was Reconstruction a success or a failure? Honestly, how you weigh its long-term impact says a whole lot about how you view American history. It's such a fascinating, deeply challenging era, and I really hope this explainer leaves you eager to dig deeper into the sources and stories of this critical time. Thanks so much for learning with us.